I've come to think some silences have shape. They rest in a room like an unopened box, taking up space you have to walk around. The cane stood beside my chair, angled just enough that I could see the place where the varnish had worn smooth from my grip. It had been weeks since the doctor told me to keep it close, but lately it seemed more like a witness than a tool. The phone rang once before I picked it up. Evelyn's voice reached me before I could greet her. They're at Mason's Grill, Matthew, Kate, and Eric. I saw them through the window. Her words came in small bursts, like she was choosing them carefully, folders all over the table, pens in their hands. They looked busy. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the table, feeling the groove worn into the wood. Evelyn filled the space between my breaths. They didn't see me. Looked like it wasn't meant for anyone else to join. The sound of a fork hitting porcelain came faintly through her end of the line. She didn't explain further, and I didn't ask her to. When the call ended, I turned the wedding ring that lay on the table so the thin edge faced me. The gold had dulled over the years, and a hairline scratch ran across it like a sentence that had been crossed out. I'd stopped wearing it after the hospital. My fingers hadn't forgiven me yet for the swelling. By morning, the silence had taken on weight. In the mailbox, among grocery circulars and charity envelopes, a single white packet lay without a return address. Inside was a sheet from the county registrar. The name Seabreeze Haven was printed in bold. Beside it, a new owner, Coastal Horizon, LLC. My name absent. I read it again, slower, letting each letter press into me. The paper trembled slightly. Where my hand held it, though, the air was still. A small brown mark sat in the corner, the kind left by a damp surface. The phone rang before I'd set the letter down. You don't need to concern yourself with Seabreeze Haven. Kate's tone was a blade without the courtesy of its sheath. It's handled. My mouth opened, but the pause on her end was short. You should be resting, not worrying about things you can't change. The line emptied. I laid the paper beside the ring. They didn't touch, but the space between them felt charged as if one understood the other's story. Mid-morning brought a message from Matthew. This will make things easier for everyone. No greeting, no explanation. Just that. The tea I'd poured sat cooling on the counter, a faint circle forming inside the cup. I thought about the chipped mug I used to keep at Seabreeze Haven, the one with a faded blue stripe near the rim. Someone else might be holding it now, not knowing it always dripped from the same spot. Another text. Eric, brief as ever. Less stress is better for your health. Don't start complications. The phrase "start complications" stayed in my mind longer than it should have, as if the movement had already begun and I'd been the one to push it forward. I turned the phone face down, its screen still glowing faintly under the glass. The kettle on the stove let out a soft hiss before falling silent. For a while, I watched the sunlight shift across the kitchen floor, catching on the edge of the letter. The ink reflected a dull glint, nothing like the brightness it once carried. I imagined the tide pulling out along the shore at Carmel by the sea, how the sand would hold the imprint of a footprint for only a moment before erasing it. No one knocked at the door. No one called again. I didn't move the letter. I didn't move the ring. Some things are best left exactly where they lie, if only to see how long they can bear the weight of their own silence. I once believed small sacrifices could buy a place in the hearts of those who shared my blood. After Robert's funeral, the calendar filled with family dates, birthdays, christenings, holiday dinners. I attended each one even when the cane was still new to my hand, even when my breath caught on the front steps. I kept my voice level, my movements measured as if steady appearances could anchor me in the current. One July afternoon during a barbecue at Matthew's, he gestured toward me from the grill. The land in Arizona is just sitting there. We could put the money to better use." The paper plate on my lap sagged under the weight of potato salad I had no appetite for. "It's not doing you any good anymore," he added, turning the meat without looking my way. 2 weeks later, my signature joined his on the transfer papers. I kept the tarnished brass key to the property in the drawer beside my bed. It had no lock to answer to now, but the metal still carried the scent of sun-warmed dust. That December, before a charity dinner, Kate studied me in the hallway mirror. "That shawl doesn't project the image we want." The knit loops caught on my bracelet when I pulled it from my shoulders. I folded it twice and set it in the back seat of her car. The sequined jacket she handed me felt stiff under my fingers, as if it had been waiting for another owner entirely. When Eric's son graduated from college, I wrapped a fountain pen in dark blue paper, looping the ribbon until it looked too fine to untie. The card inside read, "Wishing you a future as bright as your ambition." I mailed it with a tracked envelope. The ceremony came and went. No seat was left empty for me. Thanksgiving that year was at Kate's. I brought cranberry bread still warm in its tin. Matthew raised his glass before carving the turkey. Family means pulling together, not holding each other back. His eyes moved over the table but stopped short of mine. Later in the kitchen, Kate placed a plate of half-eaten pie near the sink. "You don't have to insert yourself into every decision." Her tone was almost casual, like a correction offered to a stranger in line. I rinsed the plate, my hands steady in the warm water. The dish towel I reached for was frayed at the edges, each loose thread curling like it had been waiting for release. There were other moments, smaller in scale but no less sharp. At Easter, when I offered to host, Matthew glanced at Kate before answering. "That's too much for you. We'll manage." On Eric's birthday, I called before noon. His voice was brisk. "Busy day. The family's already here." I could hear clinking glasses in the background, and the sound of chairs scraping against a floor I knew too well. At a 4th of July picnic, Kate slid a bowl of salad toward me. "Why don't you just relax and watch the kids this year? Leave the heavy lifting to us?" The plastic fork she'd set inside was missing one tine, the handle warm from her grip. I told myself these were kindnesses, not exclusions. That stepping back was a form of contribution. That their certainty in what I should or shouldn't do came from care, not convenience. Still, I learned to adjust without instruction. I arrived at events a few minutes after they began, so I wouldn't have to navigate the first flurry of greetings. I left before the last toast, so no one would need to offer me a ride. I stopped bringing dishes that required oven space. I switched from glass bowls to plastic containers, easier to tuck into a corner of someone else's refrigerator. At home, I kept the phone close but rarely used it. The ring of an incoming call had a different weight than the quiet that followed when it wasn't for me. Once, after a Sunday lunch, Matthew walked me to the door. "You make things harder when you get stuck on details." The doormat under my feet had a faded welcome pressed into it, the letters nearly erased. Another time when I mentioned the repairs needed at Seabreeze Haven, Kate's reply was quick. "It's not a priority for you anymore." I kept a photograph of that house in the kitchen drawer, tucked under a stack of recipe cards. The frame was chipped, and a thin line of salt had crystallized inside the glass from years of sea air. I didn't look at it often. I mailed Christmas cards every year, each one signed in black ink. Sometimes they arrived with no acknowledgement. Sometimes, weeks later, a group text would appear on my phone, an image of the whole family around a tree, their faces bright under the flash. My name never appeared in the captions. I thought I was protecting something by staying quiet, that if I avoided friction, the shape of us would hold. But each concession seemed to carve out a little more space where I wasn't needed. It took me longer than it should have to notice the pattern. Looking back, I wonder if my silence had become a language they preferred one they could translate however they wished without correction. I learned long ago that the smallest things are the ones that hold. 5 Christmases back, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, the kind sold in bulk shiny paper, a gold sticker sealing the flap. The handwriting was Matthew's quick angled forward, as if running late. I slid it open with the butter knife, careful not to tear the edge. The card inside read, "To Kate, Eric, and family." No mention of me, though. I had wrapped the sweaters stacked beneath their tree that year. The ribbon on Kate's package had frayed where my scissors caught, so I tied it twice. I remembered because my hands ached that morning, the cold deep in my knuckles. One July evening, we were on Matthew's back patio. The citronella candle hissed in the damp air. "Here's to the closing you pulled it off." He lifted his glass toward Kate. Chairs scraped closer, the toast echoed. I waited, thinking there might be room for my own news. When the laughter dimmed, I mentioned the board election at the charitable trust. My words rested for a breath on the table between the bread basket and a sweating pitcher before slipping away. Eric spoke of a coastal trip he'd booked, and the thread was gone. When 3 of my oil paintings sold at a small Santa Rosa gallery, Evelyn Brooks came. She hugged me in the doorway, smelling faintly of lavender talc, and pressed a foil-wrapped cookie into my hand for later. That evening, I set the check on the mantel wedged between Robert's photo and the brass clock he used to polish on Sundays. The clock ticked in the dark, like something remembering to breathe. My children never asked the price, never asked at all. At Eric's youngest's birthday, I stood by the kitchen island with a paper plate of cake, the frosting already sliding. "You could have just sent a gift card," Kate murmured, fixing the boy's party hat. Her eyes skimmed over me, settling on a guest at the door. Labor Day one year, I brought a jar of homemade relish to the picnic, the glass cool against my palm. "That's nice," Matthew remarked, setting it beside the mustard without lifting the lid. It came home with me, still sealed, the vinegar sharper after the drive. There was the night I stopped by unannounced with soup for Kate when she'd been unwell. She opened the door just enough. "We're fine. You didn't need to." Her hand stayed on the edge of the door as if holding something in place. Once, during a talk about Seabreeze Haven renovations, Matthew said, "It's not really your concern anymore," while passing the bread to Eric. The loaf reached me, untouched the crust, cool against my fingers. I had learned to measure my words. At another dinner, I mentioned a lecture on early American folk art. "Sounds quaint," Eric said, cutting into his steak. The knife scraped in a slow arc that seemed to finish my sentence for me. A framed photograph of Robert had been requested years earlier by Kate's eldest. I mailed it with a note. Months later, visiting their house, I saw it on a side table, face turned toward the wall. At a neighborhood yard sale, I recognized a scarf I had knitted for Eric's wife, charcoal yarn, uneven at the fringe. A price tag dangled from one end. "We're decluttering." She smiled like explanation was unnecessary. I kept these things the way wood keeps salt, the grain darkening the surface, roughening. The last Thanksgiving before Robert passed, Matthew had raised his glass families about showing up. I nodded, though I knew how uneven that could be. On a birthday call to Kate, her voice was brisk. "I'm stepping into a meeting. Let's talk another time." The line hummed in my hand, the dial tone replacing her voice, as if it had always been there. At Eric's anniversary toast, Kate thanked those who stood by us from the beginning. My fork paused over the plate. My name did not belong in that sentence, and so it was not placed there. The pattern was not built from the grand gestures, but from the omissions. Names left out. Glances moved elsewhere. Conversations that shut softly like a door in another room. One autumn afternoon, I stopped by Kate's with a pie warm in its tin. She took it with both hands. "We already have dessert," she said, setting it beside the fridge. When I left hours later, it was still there untouched. Even the way invitations arrived, sometimes late, sometimes not at all, spoke in their own language. A pause before mentioning a gathering, a shrug when explaining why I hadn't been included. I learned to read the absence before it arrived, a tone in the voice, the glance toward someone else to answer for them. A gift returned in its wrapping, as if the tape had never been torn. Over time, these moments became a quiet ledger, pages filled without ink. They did not shout. They settled in the corners, heavy enough to shape the air. It was possible to still see the light inside a room, but know the door would not open. And after a while, I stopped stepping forward to knock. I have learned that betrayal rarely arrives in a single blow. It seeps in like water, finding the lowest seam. Matthew came by on a Thursday afternoon. He brought a paper sack of groceries, set them on the counter without removing his coat. His watch face caught the light each time he moved his hand, the ticking a little too loud in the quiet room. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a chipped mug, when his voice drifted from the living room. "I'll stop by Silver Pines tomorrow to see the place," he said into his phone. "Clark thinks we can have her paperwork done by next week." There was a pause, and then Kate's voice tinny through the speaker. "Once she's in there, we can handle the rest. The gallery says the painting collection could bring in $420, maybe more if we split the set." The sapphire set, Clark estimated $85. Eric's voice followed. "The Buick's easy to move. The condo too, once she's out." I held the mug under the running water until it overflowed, the heat fading from my fingers. "Matthew again. When she's settled, the accounts will be straightforward. Seabreeze sells, we split 3 ways, no mess." The sound of a drawer closing, his shoes shifting on the rug. "Trust me, it'll be easier for everyone." I stayed where I was, the hum of the refrigerator between us. My thumb found the groove in the mug's handle, the glaze worn smooth over years of use. Later, when he left, the paper sack still sat unopened on the counter. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, tokens meant to look like care. That evening, I took out the old address book from the desk drawer. The spine was cracked, a ribbon of tape holding the cover. Howard Ellis's number was still written in Robert's handwriting, black ink now faded to gray. I dialed. "Howard, I need you to check a property record for me. Seabreeze Haven." He called back after dusk. His voice was careful. "Joanne, you're not the listed owner anymore. It's under Benjamin Harper." The name sat there familiar and impossible. Maggie Harper's boy. Maggie, who once drove me to the hospital in the middle of the night, who shared her mother's pie recipe on an index card still tucked in my cookbook. She'd been gone 8 years. Benjamin had been 16 when Robert and I took him along to Seabreeze for the first time. He'd spent the week fishing off the rocks, bringing back shells in his pockets. Howard cleared his throat. "Do you want me to send you the filings?" "Yes." After we hung up, I set the phone on the table beside Robert's leather-bound ledger. The clasp no longer closed, the strap worn soft. I didn't open it. The next day, Kate called. "You don't need to get involved with any of this. We've already arranged everything." I said nothing, and she filled the silence. "You'll be more comfortable at Silver Pines. No stairs, no stress. You'll have people around you, meals made. It's for the best." The words were practiced as if they'd been said aloud before. "I'm not moving," I replied. Her exhale was quick. "You're not in a position to decide that anymore." I rested my palm on the table, the wood cool beneath my skin. Eric texted that night. "Clark's ready when you are. No greeting. No signature." I scrolled through old messages, past photographs of the grandchildren, recipes sent years ago, reminders for holidays. The gaps between them had widened over time until there was nothing but logistics. The next Sunday, Matthew stopped by again. He walked through the house as if taking inventory, glancing at the china cabinet, the hall closet, Robert's desk. You've been holding on to too much. These things just weigh you down. His hand hovered over the ledger. They're not yours, I said. They will be. His tone was flat, matter of fact. We're not doing this to hurt you. We're doing it to move forward. I remembered Benjamin Harper at 16, standing in the kitchen at Seabreeze salt water, dripping from his hair, telling Robert he wanted to live by the ocean someday. I remembered Maggie's voice, rough from chemo, asking me to make sure Ben always had a place to land. The papers from Howard arrived 2 days later. I opened the envelope with the same butter knife I'd used on Matthew's Christmas card years before. Inside, transfer documents. Signatures I didn't recognize, a notary seal dated 6 months ago. On the last page, Benjamin's name in block letters. I left the papers on the kitchen table beside the mug I'd stopped washing midstream. The water stain beneath it had dried into a faint ring. Some decisions grow in the dark, without witnesses. 8 years earlier, when Maggie's breathing had grown shallow, and the hospice nurse kept glancing at the clock, Robert and I sat across from her at the kitchen table. The paperwork lay between us, the edges curling from the damp air. Seabreeze Haven would be in Ben's name, ours to use for the rest of our lives, but his to hold in the future. Robert's hand was steady on the pen. Mine hesitated a fraction too long, but I signed. We never told the children. Not then, not later. They had made their feelings clear when we'd paid Ben's first semester of tuition, calling it favoritism toward someone not blood. Maggie was gone within the week. Ben had the deed locked in his own safe, and I returned to my life with a folded copy tucked between old Christmas cards. Now, standing in the hallway with my hand resting on the wall, I had listened to every word in the living room. Matthew's voice was brisk, Kate's clipped, Eric's almost bored. They were confident. They believed control was already theirs. 2 days later, Matthew called. Silver Pines has an opening. Clark can move the paperwork fast. Just a physical, nothing invasive. I'm fine here. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking enough. This resistance isn't helping anyone. I let the pause stretch until the hum of the line became louder than his voice. That evening, I unlocked Robert's desk for the first time in months. The drawer still smelled faintly of cedar oil. Inside were letters from him to Maggie, photographs with edges gone soft, and a fountain pen wrapped in a handkerchief. The pen had signed the Seabreeze Haven transfer. I turned the brass key in the lock until it clicked, the sound small but final. Eric's text arrived the next morning. Need condo papers signed by Friday. Clark can bring them over. I placed the phone face down. Kate arrived that afternoon. She stood in the doorway, gloves still on. You need to be practical. This isn't about taking things from you, it's about keeping you safe. I've managed. For now. You've had your independence long enough. Things change. Her eyes scanned the room as if cataloging. She didn't ask about the locked drawer. After she left, I went to the hall closet and brought down the cedar box from the top shelf. Inside lay Robert's navy ring, the program from our wedding, and a scarf Maggie had once left behind, thin as tissue, smelling faintly of sandalwood. I moved the fountain pen into my sewing basket under a tangle of loose threads. Evelyn Brooks called over the fence the next morning while I stood with a bag of paper for recycling. You're clearing out, just making space. Her gaze lingered on the envelopes. Hope you're not going anywhere. I didn't answer. Later that day, I slid my hand under the bread box and peeled away the tape holding my safe deposit key. The residue left a pale stripe on my fingertip. Matthew's number appeared again. If you won't do the exam, we'll have to get a statement from a doctor. We can arrange it without you. I know how arrangements work. This isn't worth the fight. The line went quiet, then disconnected. That night I took the linen closet apart. Between two folded quilts, I hid sealed envelopes of photographs Robert on the porch swing, Maggie at the stove, Ben in his graduation gown. The house seemed to notice what I had moved. Drawers shut with less ease. Shelves looked taller, shadows longer. At the kitchen table, I held Robert's leather-bound ledger strap worn from years of his thumb tracing it while he thought. I didn't open it. My hand stayed on the strap, pressing lightly, as if the pressure could keep the contents from shifting. Kate left a voicemail the next morning. "You know we're doing this because we care. The sooner you let go, the smoother it will be." In the sink, a coffee cup sat with a faint ring inside the mark, left after I'd poured it out untouched. I rinsed it clean, dried it, set it in the cabinet, and closed the door. Evelyn stopped by with a jar of preserves. Ben called me last week checking in. He's busy at the clinic, but he asked if you needed anything. I told her no. She didn't press. After she left, I found the envelope with Ben's last letter creases worn thin, where I'd opened it too often. He had written about his residency, about how Maggie used to tell him that Seabreeze Haven would always be his home too. I placed it in the cedar box and slid the lid shut. Matthew tried again that evening. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Just let us handle the sales and you can focus on your comfort." Comfort isn't what I'm short on. What then? Time. He didn't answer. I kept the desk drawer locked. I kept the key in my pocket, the metal warm against my palm by nightfall. In the pantry behind the flour tin, I placed a folder containing the original signed agreement with Ben the notary stamp still sharp. Above it, I tucked a small slip of paper with a name and number. Howard Ellis Roberts' oldest friend and the only attorney I trusted. The house was quiet that night, except for the clock in the hall. Its tick was steady, unhurried. I sat with the ledger in my lap, the strap beneath my fingers. I had not told them what I knew. I had not corrected their assumptions. My silence was not surrender. Some protections are made stronger when no one sees them being built. Not all absences are noticed right away. Howard didn't question my request. He simply named a place, a diner on the edge of town, where the blinds were bent in the middle and the coffee pot never seemed to empty. It wasn't the kind of place my children would step into. I arrived early, choosing a booth near the back where the light fell in narrow stripes across the table. Ben walked in wearing a jacket the color of wet gravel. His hair had grown longer than I remembered, curling slightly at the collar. He slid into the booth without taking off his jacket. I set the manila envelope between us, its flap sealed with a strip of tape I'd pressed down twice. "It's all here," I said quietly. "The deed copy, the notary stamp, the original agreement." His hand hovered above it, but didn't touch. "If they call, don't respond. Just call me or Howard. No explanations to anyone." A waitress filled our mugs, the coffee running over the rim of mine and pooling in the saucer. The smell was sharp, almost metallic. I didn't wipe it away. "They're not going to like silence," he said. "They already dislike enough things about me." He looked down at his mug as though the steam might offer an answer. We didn't linger over goodbyes. The envelope disappeared into his bag, and with it the only leverage I had left. Back at the house, I found the air too still. Every object seemed fixed in place, as if watching me. By the next morning, I had decided not to spend my days here. I began leaving before 8, locking the door with the extra turn Robert used to insist on. The library became my refuge. Its corners were shadowed and quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't expect anything from me. I chose the same table each time, one with a lamp whose shade had faded unevenly pale on the side, facing the window. People came and went, carrying their noise with them. I kept mine inside. Afternoons were for the park. I walked the same loop, stopping occasionally to watch the ducks, though I never fed them. I wanted to be seen, but not approached. Let the neighbors report that I was out and about. Activity could be mistaken for stability. 3 days and Kate's voice arrived on the answering machine. You're never home. We can't help you if you're always out. I erased it without replaying. Howard called one evening, his tone clipped. Ben has the documents secured. That's enough. They'll push harder. They've already pushed past decency. He didn't respond. Just let the line go quiet before ending the call. I started carrying a small notebook, the kind with thin pages that bend under a pen's pressure. I wrote without dates, small fragments, the way their voices dropped when they spoke about me. The letterhead on the papers they'd planned to use the exact blue of Maggie's scarf the day we signed the transfer. I didn't intend to use these notes for lawyers. They were for Lila, so one day she might understand how silence can be forced on someone without ever being ordered. Eric's text came while I was in the library. Clark needs your signature for the Santa Rosa condo sale. I put the phone face down on the table and went back to my notes. Saturday. Matthew appeared unannounced. He stayed at the doorway, his eyes moving over the room like a scanner. You're making this harder than it has to be. I'm not the one making it. You can't manage on your own forever. I've managed longer than you've thought about it. His mouth tightened, but he didn't step further in. We're trying to do what's best for you. That's what worries me. He left without touching anything, though I noticed his gaze pause on the oak desk in the corner. After the door closed, I checked the top drawer. The letters were still there, bundled in the ribbon Robert had used. I locked it and placed the key in the sewing basket under a tangle of thread. The next week in the park, Evelyn was on her usual bench, a paperback in her hands. Seeing you here so much new routine, something like that. Good for you. Better than sitting inside. I gave her a small smile, letting her believe it was choice, not strategy. By the month's end, the notebook was half full. I never reread what I'd written. The point was preservation, not reflection. Each page felt like setting aside a coin in a jar, quiet accumulation for a day yet to come. One afternoon, as I closed the notebook, I noticed the faint indentation of my handwriting on the next blank page. Even when the ink is gone, the pressure remains. Through the library window, the horizon showed a thin strip of ocean. The light struck it at an angle that made the surface look almost metallic. Seabreeze Haven still stood there, unlisted and untouched, carrying a history no paper could erase. I placed the notebook in my bag, fastened the clasp, and slid the strap over my shoulder. Some moves are made long before the other side knows the game has begun. Some apologies arrive wrapped in fruit. 2 weeks had passed since I'd met Ben in that quiet roadside cafe since the papers were placed in his hands, and my part in that house was no longer a question. I hadn't heard from Matthew or Kate in all that time. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, the phone rang. I let it ring twice before picking up. We should meet. Matthew's voice came through lighter than it had been in months. There are things to settle. About the assets. And where you'll be safest. His choice of words told me more than the words themselves. There was a smoothness in his tone, the kind people put on when they've been told to repair something that's starting to show in public. He spoke of family responsibility, of wanting to be sure everything was handled correctly. I made small noises that could be taken as agreement. Howard had mentioned almost casually that Clark Peterson, the attorney Matthew liked to use, had learned about Ben's legal hold on Seabreeze Haven. I didn't ask how the information traveled. News has its own way of finding the people who need it. 3 days later, Kate arrived at my door with a paper bag that smelled faintly of pears past their best. She stood there with a smile that didn't quite match her eyes. We've been thinking, she began, stepping inside without waiting. Maybe we should keep everything, within the family. She set the bag down on the kitchen counter, the fruit shifting softly inside. It would make things so much simpler if you signed a few papers. Nothing major, just a formality to streamline management. I gestured toward the table. She found the cups in the cabinet without asking, placing them side by side. I filled the kettle and waited for it to heat. The sound of the water seemed louder than usual, filling the spaces between her words. "It's not healthy for you to be burdened with all these details," she went on. "There are other things you should be focusing on now." The steam began to rise from the spout. I poured the pale tea blooming in each cup. She adjusted the pears in a shallow bowl, turning them so the bruises faced down. "I'm not sure my memory is sharp enough for new arrangements," I said after a pause. "I'd need time. Maybe write things down." Her smile dipped for a moment before returning, fixed in place. "Of course, but sooner would be better. For everyone." We sat. The tea cooled between us. She glanced at her phone twice, tapping the screen without reading whatever had appeared. When she finally took a sip, the tea was already losing its heat. "I'll bring the papers by," she added, rising. "We'll make it easy for you." The bag of pears remained on the counter after she left. One of them had rolled free, resting near the edge with its blemish now visible. That evening, a message from Matthew arrived. "Glad you and Kate talked. Let's keep moving forward." No explanation of what forward meant. No question of whether I wanted to move in that direction at all. The next morning, I sliced one of the pears for breakfast. The flesh inside was already browning around the core. I ate it anyway slowly while looking at the chipped cup from the day before. I remembered Robert once telling me that some cups can't be mended without showing the break. Even if you seal them perfectly, they'll never hold heat the same way again. Kate called again the following afternoon. "We could have lunch this weekend, just the three of us. Clear the air." Her voice was smooth, but the invitation felt more like a summons. "I'll think about it," I told her. "You should. It's important." The line went quiet for a moment, then she ended the call. I opened the kitchen drawer and found the old tea strainer Robert used. It had a fine dent along one side, just enough to make the leaves catch if you weren't careful. I set it on the counter and left it there, a reminder that not everything in a kitchen or a family needs to be put back into service. That weekend came and went without lunch. I heard nothing more about it. A small reprieve, or perhaps just a pause while they considered a different angle. Howard phoned on Monday with a brief update about some paperwork unrelated to the house. Before hanging up, he mentioned again, almost as if testing the words, that Ben's ownership was fully secure. I thanked him and let the conversation end there. By Tuesday, the pears were starting to soften into themselves. I threw 2 away, kept 1 for baking, and left the rest in the bowl. Sometimes it's enough to let things spoil quietly without announcing that you're the one who chose not to eat them. In the quiet of the kitchen, I poured a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling and lifting toward the window. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't draft a reply to Matthew's message. The tea cooled slowly, and I let it. Some things you stop trying to warm back up. I no longer keep the grocery list on the refrigerator door. It stays in my pocket now, folded into a square no bigger than a postage stamp, the ink smudged in places where my thumb rests too long. At the market, I push the small handcart slowly, letting the wheels squeak without apology. The woman selling tomatoes asks if I want them firm or ripe. I tell her firm without hesitation. She smiles, remembering how I used to linger over every choice. Now I move on before the question can feel like a test. At the bread stall, a man in a faded baseball cap hands me a warm loaf. "You're here earlier than usual," I nod, tapping the paper bag against my palm. The weight feels honest bread I bought myself, with no one keeping track. Back home, I leave the groceries in their bags for a while. The kitchen clock ticks without rhythm, like it wants to confuse me. On the counter, my old mug with the hairline crack still holds yesterday's coffee stain. I run my finger along the rim. It's the only cup I use now. A flyer from the community center sits under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. I had circled art class, beginner's welcome in blue pen 2 weeks ago. The first session, my hand trembled so much the pencil rolled off the table twice. By the third, the lines curved where I wanted them to. The instructor never asked why I chose flowers over faces. In the afternoons, I walk the park's coastal path, the one that skirts the edge of Santa Rosa. Children race their bikes ahead of parents who pretend to be chasing them. I pass an older couple sharing a bench, his cane leaning against her knee. The ocean wind lifts my scarf just enough for me to tuck it back in. One Thursday, Matthew arrived unannounced. His shoes left faint marks on the entry rug I had just shaken out that morning. He looked at the bookshelf, then at the closed door to the study. "We should take a look at the file cabinet," his voice low, almost careful. "That's my space," I told him, hands resting on the doorframe. "You don't go in there." He didn't argue, but his eyes held the kind of silence that tries to wait you out. Later, I found a grocery receipt on the kitchen counter, his, not mine. 2 bottles of wine, imported cheese, nothing I'd eat. He must have set it down while pretending to check the mail. I folded it twice and dropped it into the small wastebasket under the sink. Lila has been coming more often. She doesn't knock loudly, just enough for me to hear before the door opens. She brings paperbacks, some with bent spines, some new. We sit at the dining table, the photo albums spread out like maps we've yet to finish. "Grandpa's handwriting looks like yours," she says, tracing a finger under his looping letters. I keep my eyes on the photo of him in the navy sweater. One hand in his pocket, standing by the old Buick. Once, she pulled a tiny seashell from her coat pocket. "From the beach near Seabreeze Haven," she said. I didn't ask how she knew to go there. I only took the shell and set it beside the cracked mug on the counter. When I write in the mornings now, it isn't to explain myself. The notebook stays open until lunch pages, filled with dates and fragments, Maggie's scarf blue with frayed edges, Ben's letter unopened since 2015, Lila's left-handed tea pour. I keep the handwriting small, not for secrecy, but to take up less space. "Matthew called last week. We just want to keep things simple, Mom." The word simple hung there like a coat on a hook no one uses. "Things are already simple," I said. My tone didn't invite a reply. Kate texted the next day. "We could help with bills if you let us manage some of your accounts." I typed, "Everything's fine," then put the phone face down on the table. At the art class, I've started using ink instead of pencil. The lines are less forgiving, but they stay where I put them. Last session, a woman I barely know said, "That bougainvillea looks like it belongs somewhere real." I told her it does. The bougainvillea outside my front porch had gone brittle over the years, its blooms thin and hesitant. One warm afternoon, I trimmed away the dead vines. The clippings filled the trash bin to the brim. My gloves caught on the thorns, leaving tiny loops of red thread. I didn't mend them. When the soil was ready, I pressed the new roots in, gently tamping down the earth with both hands. A breeze caught the loose strands of my hair. Somewhere in the street, a car door closed, but I didn't turn to see who it was. I remembered the last time the bougainvillea had bloomed fully. It was after a season of storms. The petals had been the color of old wine, deep and unapologetic. Back then, I'd cut a few sprigs for the kitchen window, letting them dry in a chipped vase. They'd lasted longer than I expected. Lila arrived as I was rinsing the dirt from my hands. She noticed the trimmed vines. "It looks different," she said, stepping closer to the porch. "It is," I replied, brushing my palms on my apron. She smiled, but didn't ask more. That evening, I poured tea into the cracked mug. The steam curled just enough to fog the rim. Outside, the newly planted bougainvillea leaned slightly in the wind, not yet strong enough to stand tall. I watched it until the tea cooled. I thought of the shell Lila brought me, still by the mug. and how both would remain where they were until I chose otherwise. No one else would decide that. I didn't need to write it down. Some things were better left unwritten not because they were secrets, but because they had already settled into place. I had been turning the envelope over in my hands for almost an hour before I decided it was time. The paper was thick, the kind that resisted creases, yet I could still feel the faint indentation of Howard's handwriting on the flap. He had called earlier, his voice low, telling me every account now sat under my sole authority. No pending authorizations, no loopholes they could use. I imagined his desk when he said it, orderly stacks of brass lamp angled toward a legal pad, and realized the picture in my mind was steadier than any relief. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table, the letter was already forming in my head. One line. No flourishes, no explanations. My pen felt heavier than it should have. From now on, every decision about my property and my life is mine alone. There is nothing further to discuss. I read it twice before folding it. 3 envelopes, the same sentence copied in the same even strokes. I addressed them separately. Matthew Kate, Eric without titles, without endearments. The Seabreeze Haven file lay beside me, the signed page from Ben resting on top. His name in ink was steady, more confident than I remembered from his student years. I slid a copy into each envelope, aligning the edges so nothing stuck out. The act felt like sealing a window against a draft. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the post office. The clerk, a man with silver hair tucked neatly behind his ears, asked if I wanted tracking numbers. I shook my head. The point wasn't to follow the letters, only to let them land. When I got home, I opened the desk drawer and took out the family photograph that had hung in the living room for years. The glass was faintly dusty. My thumb left a clean crescent where it rested. I placed it face down in a storage box and replaced it with a picture of Maggie and me at the shore, her scarf caught mid-lift by the wind, my hand anchoring it without thought. That moment had never been staged, and it looked it. By evening, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, Matthew's voice was measured. I got your letter. If this is the route you want, fine. But you're making things harder than they have to be. Kate's message came not long after. We could have resolved this together. Now it's all locked up. I hope you know what you're doing. Eric didn't call. The kettle whistled sharp, then fading. I poured the water over a sprig of peppermint, watching the color seep slowly into the cup. The steam rose in thin spirals, breaking against the underside of the cabinet. There was a knock, 2 short, 1 long. Ben's pattern. I opened the door to find him with a folder under his arm. They might try again, different angle, he murmured, sliding the folder across the table. This covers contingencies. Howard thought you'd want them. I nodded and placed the folder beside the unopened mail. He glanced at the new photograph on the wall, but didn't comment. They won't like it, he added. They don't have to, I replied. He stayed just long enough to drink half a glass of water, then left without saying goodbye in words. The next morning, I visited the bank. The manager recognized me and led me to his office, where I signed the forms naming Howard and Ben as my sole representatives if I became unavailable. The pen's barrel was smooth cool against my fingers. Each signature was deliberate, the ink settling into the paper fibers like something that intended to stay. When I stepped back into the lobby, the light through the tall windows caught on the floor tiles, turning them briefly into a pattern of pale gold and shadow. I paused there longer than necessary, letting people pass around me. At home, I opened the kitchen window to air out the faint scent of peppermint. The wind carried in a trace of salt from the coast. On the counter, the stack of legal papers sat squared corners aligned. I had no desire to hide them. In the afternoon, Lila came by. She noticed the change on the wall almost immediately. You moved the family picture, she said, more as an observation than a question. I put it somewhere safe, I told her. Her eyes rested on Maggie's photograph for a moment. She looks like she's about to say something. She usually was. We didn't talk about the letters, though I suspected she knew. Instead, she helped me trim a few branches from the bougainvillea, the petals scattering like paper scraps across the porch. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table, the cup of peppermint tea in front of me, cooling in slow increments. I thought about the calls I might still receive, the visits that might carry forced smiles or clipped tones. I thought about the absence of any need to answer. The tea had lost its heat by the time I lifted it. The first sip was faintly bitter, the leaves having sat too long. I drank it anyway. I didn't clear the cup right away. It stayed there on the table, a small anchor in the room's quiet. There was no triumph in the air, no final chord. Just the even rhythm of the clock on the wall, and the knowledge that for once, nothing needed to be defended. I let that be enough. I no longer count the days. The calendar still hangs by the fridge, but its pages are mostly blank, the numbers fading slightly from sunlight. The kettle on the stove hums before it whistles. I pour the hot water over dried chamomile, watching the petals swell their pale color, leaching into gold. The steam curls upward, thin and steady. A small postcard leans against the sugar jar. Ben's handwriting is angled, deliberate. The house is still here as promised. Thank you for trusting me. The picture on the front is of Seabreeze Haven's porch in late afternoon light, the railing shadow falling across the steps, just as I remember. I touch the card's edge and leave it propped exactly where it is. The bougainvillea outside has grown fuller petals drifting onto the window ledge. Their shape reminds me of folded envelopes. My phone buzzes once. A message from Kate community event went well. Thought you'd like to know. No question mark, no invitation. I type glad to hear and leave it at that. Matthew's name hasn't appeared on my screen in months. Last I heard, he had shifted his attention back to his firm. A mutual acquaintance mentioned clients leaving quietly after whispers of what he'd tried to do. When the story reached me, it carried no weight to press on my chest, just the faint sound of a door closing somewhere far off. Eric stops by some weekends with his son. Today is not one of those days. Last time, he stood in my kitchen turning a mug in his hands. "You've made this place different," he remarked, eyes on the open shelves. "I only changed what needed changing." He nodded once and didn't press. On Thursdays, I take my small easel to the community art room. The scent of acrylic paint clings to my sleeves when I return. Last week, I sold a small canvas at the market. Nothing more than a row of worn fishing boats, but the buyer looked at it like it was more than pigment on cloth. Howard and Evelyn sometimes join me for a slow walk along the shoreline. Evelyn always brings a scarf, even when it's warm. Howard, hands in pockets, talks more to the wind than to either of us. There is comfort in company that asks for nothing. One morning, Lila brought over a notebook with a soft green cover. "For your writing," she told me, setting it on the table. "It might take a while to fill." That's fine. Some stories need time to grow. The notebook lies open on the counter now, its first page half covered in lines about the years before the fracture. I do not write to sharpen blame or polish excuses. I write because certain truths belong to more than one generation, and Lila should not have to piece them together from scattered remarks at family gatherings. In late afternoon, I brew another cup of tea, the chamomile lighter this time, less steeped. Through the open window, I hear children calling to each other down the street. Their words blur into a rhythm without meaning. The landline rings. I let it sound twice before answering. It's Kate's voice, smooth but thin. "I was thinking, maybe we could have lunch next week. Neutral place, no papers involved." "Neutral is good," I reply. "I'll check my schedule." She doesn't promise to follow up, and I don't ask her to. Later, sorting through the bottom drawer in the living room, I find a wool cardigan with a missing button. It still smells faintly of lavender from last winter's storage. I fold it neatly, even though I know I may never wear it again, and place it on the shelf beside a stack of unused picture frames. Evenings are quieter now. The lamp on the desk casts a small circle of light over the notebook. I add a sentence or two, then stop, leaving space for whatever might come later. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of salt into the room. I glance at the postcard again, its corners beginning to curl. The image is fixed, yet the real house is still there, holding its place against weather and time. Lila once asked me if I missed how things were before. I told her some parts of before are best left unvisited, like rooms where the air has gone stale. She didn't press for more. I haven't stepped into Seabreeze Haven since Ben took it over. I don't need to. Knowing it's kept, that it stands in the care of someone who understands what it meant is enough. The chamomile is cooler now. I take slow sips, not rushing the end. The clock ticks evenly in the background each second, folding into the next without weight. My hands rest on the table, palms open. There is no letter to write, no defense to mount, no permission to ask. Outside, the bougainvillea sways lightly, scattering more petals onto the ledge. I glance at the photograph of Maggie and me from years ago, her hair caught mid-motion, my sleeve brushing hers. For a moment, I think of the way she used to hum without realizing it, the sound low and even more felt than heard. I don't frame the thought with longing or loss. I let it pass like wind through an open window. The teacup is empty now. I leave it on the table, the faint ring of moisture it left already fading into the wood. Nothing in the room demands my attention, and nothing in me feels the need to prove a single thing. I sit there a while longer, not waiting for anything.